Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Joseph Aldy, a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, where his work focuses on climate change and energy policy. He also is a university fellow at Resources for the Future, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Joe Aldy previously served as special assistant to President Obama for energy and environment. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard and a master's of environmental management from the Nicholas School of the Environment. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event is being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Joe Aldy, welcome to The Prescription.
Thanks, Howard. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thank you. So it's an interesting time to have this conversation. In the current legislative debate, Democrats are paying a lot of rhetorical attention to climate change, but their focus mostly is on eliminating tax subsidies for fossil fuel production and increasing tax subsidies for alternative energy. Democrats also are discussing a package of financial carrots and sticks to encourage electric utilities to develop clean energy production. So the bottom line question is all that enough to significantly slow climate change?
Well, I think it represents a significant increase in the ambition of what we would see using various levers of the government to try to reduce emissions. You can think about it as the government's got three major ways they can reduce emissions. They could regulate the sources of emissions. You can't really do that through reconciliation. You can subsidize the clean sources of energy like wind and solar, or improvements in energy efficiency, so we get more energy services for our energy inputs. Or we can try to penalize the really polluting sources of energy like coal. So they are doing a mix of these policies. When we look at some of the analysis of what came out of the House, it's potential that you can make a pretty significant degree of progress towards President Biden's goal, which is to have U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030. But again, part of this is going to be the devil in the details of what comes out of the Senate, how we actually structure some of the programs for the power sector, and whether or not we might have the political appetite for putting some kind of tax penalty on sources of emissions, whether it's fossil CO2 or perhaps on methane, which are both under consideration right now.
So where they're going so far, at least in the House, is not to really do much to penalize production, just simply to take away existing subsidies. So again, my question, do you think that's enough?
Is that enough? Well, the House bill has this kind of interesting program for the power sector. The idea here is that if you are selling more electricity to customers that come from clean energy sources like wind and solar, and if you show growth in that over time, you get a large grant from the government. If you fail to demonstrate progress, you would actually have to pay a penalty to the government. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about the way they've designed it is that the subsidy is much greater than the penalty. And a number of economists have raised concerns about the potential for gaming that could go on here. The subsidies for renewables could be quite large when we look at both what a utility would get for selling renewable power and for the extension of existing tax credits with some modifications, but existing tax credits for building new solar facilities and wind farms and so on. So there's some analysis that suggests we might be able to reduce our emissions, say 40% by 2030, if we were to do the program that came out of the House. But that analysis is assuming we're not going to get the kind of gaming going on, because you could have a scenario where suppose, Howard, you and I both ran some utilities. You run a utility, I run a utility, and we both increase our sourcing of clean energy for power to our customers by 2% from last year. Under this program, we would both pay a penalty to the federal government because we're supposed to increase our clean energy by 4%. The thing is, I could enter into a contract with you and I'd say, I increased my power 2%. Why didn't I sell you that 2%? You've now increased your power of 4%. I have not increased my power at all. I have to pay a penalty for failing to meet my goal. You're getting a subsidy, and actually your subsidy more than pays for all the penalty I have to pay. So we could have a scenario where the government goes from the two of us each paying penalties to the government now being on net paying the two of us combined, but we've had no change in our clean energy generation. And I think that's something that people have raised concerns about when evaluating what's in the House proposal. I will acknowledge, though, the politics, which is if you're concerned that the penalty is too low relative to the subsidy in the House, the Senate may come back with an even lower penalty because there's not a lot of appetite, I think, for having among the coal industry and having a penalty that is targeting their source of electricity. And those advocates have clearly been communicating that to Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who chairs the committee responsible for writing these provisions in the Senate side of the reconciliation.
And who represents a state for which coal is at least culturally very important, even though it's economically not so important anymore.
That is very true, yes.
The other track here, which is the longer standing track, is regulatory, Clean Air Act, that sort of thing. In your view, how much of the solution should in fact be regulatory and how much should be carbon pricing? Are they substitute for one another? Are they complementary? How do you see it?
So part of it is a function of how do you think about what makes good policy design? And the short answer is I think you want a mix of both. But also, what do you do given your existing political and institutional constraints? Right. The Clean Air Act as written can give EPA some authority for regulating greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not as ambitious of an authority and as a transparent of authority for greenhouse gas emissions as I think we would like. The challenge is it's just hard to see how you would move a new Clean Air Act or a new climate-oriented bill through this Congress that would give EPA new regulatory authorities. So they can do some things to reduce emissions, and they've done this already for tailpipe emissions from our vehicles. There have been efforts to try to reduce emissions through regulation of the power sector. They've done this to also look at methane emissions for oil and gas extraction operations. So I think there's ways they can use this regulatory authority. In some cases, I think carbon pricing. If you could do a carbon tax, or there is some discussion led by Senator Whitehouse in the Senate right now about whether a carbon fee should be part of reconciliation, that would substitute for some of these provisions. But there's still others where regulation makes a lot of sense. It may make more sense at the end of the day to think about either regulations or incentives for reducing emissions of methane at oil and gas than to tax it, because it's just kind of hard to measure your methane emissions accurately in those operations. There may be cases. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I
was also going to say there may be cases where we think people just don't make really good decisions. That some people tend to be myopic. That in those cases there may be value in thinking about how regulation and perhaps regulation combined with good information can help people make better decisions. That would really amplify the climate returns to what you might get from a carbon pricing policy like a tax or cap and trade program.
Let's talk about sort of public opinion here and people's decisions. So current legislative proposals for a carbon tax range from about $15 per ton of CO2 to $59. But some estimates suggest that even that's far short, and it'd take a tax of about $75 to maintain sustainable levels of global warming. Problem, of course, is public opinion surveys show that while Americans believe climate change is a problem, and they increasingly recognize that it's a problem, they don't want to pay even modest amounts to fix it. So how do we deal with the political constraints?
So that's one reason why I think we're focusing on spending and tax expenditures in the current legislative debate. There is a lot more support for subsidizing renewable power than there is for taxing fossil fuels, which would create a market opportunity for those renewables to come in. So I think that's the first thing. In fact, there's some analyses that suggest that the generous subsidies for renewable power might mean that even with a program that would penalize fossil fuels in the electricity sector, we might see electricity prices going down relative to what they would be otherwise, because we're subsidizing so much new build in clean energy generation. So there are ways you can try to tackle that. I think the challenge is at some point when we rely on just subsidies or subsidies and regulation is that we're foregoing the use of collecting revenues, whether it's through a carbon tax or say, like we see in California, a cap and trade program in which we auction the emission allowances. You can use those revenues in ways that can help you address some of the distributional impacts of the decarbonization agenda. Some of the regulations are actually can be fairly regressive. Some of the subsidies, like we've seen this for electric vehicles, disproportionately go to high income households. So there is, I think, an opportunity here as you start to think about what an ambitious program looks like and how you want to ensure that the benefits are enjoyed throughout the population, that you can make, I think, a more compelling case for why you want to price carbon. But politically, it's difficult to say, I want to do a tax, or I want to do something that is effectively a tax, like cap and trade, in order to reduce emissions, because of the concern that many of the opponents of that policy will raise with the public, that you're going to have to pay more for energy.
Yeah, we seem like we're in an interesting moment right now, because even as we're debating these issues, for other reasons, gasoline prices are going up.
Right.
I assume that, that someone like you, advocates for policy fight climate change, think this is a good thing that gasoline prices are going up. But consumers and most politicians, including President Biden, seem kind of unhappy with this. And
Howard, I don't actually think that's a good thing that prices are going up now for reasons that are unrelated to climate policy. I'd much rather prices go up in a manner that's predictable, consistent with a durable, comprehensive policy framework, so that households can make decisions more thoughtfully and businesses can make decisions more thoughtfully because they understand what decarbonization means for the prices they're going to be paying. So people can make decisions. So we're not surprised. I mean, the part of the reason why people get upset when we see a big run up in gasoline prices is that it's a surprise. And we may have bought a car that's less efficient or made decisions on where to live relative to where we work, that all of a sudden it's like, wait, I have to spend a lot more than I anticipated. And I think that's one of the key things, is that we could design policy in a way that gives people an understanding and an expectation about where prices are going to go. And that, I think, also is the kind of thing that will drive a lot more innovation than the sort of idiosyncratic ups and downs of world oil markets that then pass through the ups and downs that we pay for gasoline when we fill up our cars.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you raised the issue just a minute ago, and I like to dig into it a little bit more about what does the government do with substantial tax revenue from a carbon tax? And there are a number of ideas on the table, right? Some would distribute the revenue equally to all households in the form of a dividend. Others would target funds to communities where pollution or other environmental degradation is more severe. Still others would distribute the revenue to those who would suffer job losses from declines in fossil fuel production, like the folks in West Virginia.
Right.
Even in Washington, you can't spend the same dollar more than once. So what would you do? How would you, a little bit of everything, or how would you approach this?
So I think, there's a sort of two ways we might think about this. One, we might say, how do I ensure that this is at least going to be distributionally neutral, and address the concern that when we think about the first half of a carbon tax, is that it tends to be regressive. Low income households tend to have a larger share of their budgets dedicated to spending on energy. And so there's a concern that when we do a tax, it's a carbon tax, it would be regressive. How we spend those revenues can be done in a way so that we can at least eliminate the regressivity. We can make it progressive. And so that's part of what has animated the idea of sort of a dividend approach. One can make it a means tested dividend if they wanted to. I think it's one thing that a lot of the opponents of a carbon tax will always say it's regressive. And they're focusing on just the first part of it. And I think about the analog here to say Social Security. We know that the actual payroll tax that finances Social Security is not progressive. The benefits formula, when you're retired and you're actually getting paid out, is progressive. And in fact, on net, we think of Social Security as being progressive, but how we're raising the revenues is not. And so I think it is important for us to think through critically, if we're going to try to address concerns about the distributional consequences of pricing carbon, that we're thoughtful in how we use those monies to eliminate that regressivity, and perhaps even encourage some progressivity. But part of this too is just, how do you think about the political calculus? It's difficult to imagine in a 50-50 Senate that you're not going to do something that helps address the concerns about those fossil fuel reliant communities and those who've been working in fossil fuel industries without having some resources set aside to help them think about what's going to be the next stage of their economic development. How are you going to help ensure that there are jobs and there's opportunities in those communities? I think that's going to be important from the political calculus. You can imagine it's also important from the political calculus to do something to address the concerns of energy intensive manufacturing, who may be concerned that they're going to face a tough competition from foreign firms that may be operating in jurisdictions with weaker or non-existent climate change policy. So you may use some of your revenues for that. You may think about coupling it with other instruments like some kind of carbon tariff on the imports from those other countries. So a lot of this too is how do you make the political calculus work? And that's one thing. While we can't spend $1 more than once, it does give us, I think, some additional degrees of freedom that we don't have when we have, say, a regulatory approach in order to try to craft a sufficiently broad political coalition to support this kind of approach to climate change.
So you mentioned this question of an import tax on carbon-based goods. I have to say, it seems at least a little odd that a country would tax imported carbon but not put a price on domestic carbon. We're sort of in an odd situation here. I don't know what you.
Well, we have been worried about what other countries are doing or not doing on climate and what it may mean for our manufacturing long before we have ever done anything meaningful in cutting our own emissions here. So you can go back to 1997 and the lead up to the Kyoto conference, the big UN climate change talks. And this is back in an era where we had bipartisanship in the Senate. The Senate voted 95-0 on a resolution sponsored by Senators Byrd and Hagel to say the US shouldn't come back with a deal unless it has comparable commitments and emission targets for China and other big developing countries. And so this has long been a concern. But while our concern is do we lose jobs to China, right now, the EU is looking at the US and they're kind of concerned about whether or not they're going to lose jobs to us because we haven't really implemented much meaningful policy, with the exception of some of what we've done on vehicles and some of what we've been trying to do in the power sector, although we do have some state level programs that have become more and more ambitious, like in California and in the Northeast states that each have cap and trade programs. There have been some discussions about whether or not we figure out what's the sort of shadow price, if you will, of carbon through existing regulatory approaches on US industry and use that as a basis for how we might impose a tariff on foreign competition. I think this is all more of how you make the politics work and addressing this concern that some key stakeholders have and some members of Congress have by saying, we're not going to be losing jobs and we're not going to be losing environmental benefits. I mean, it's a double whammy. It's not just that jobs and industry may relocate. It means in other places their emissions go up, offsetting some of the environmental gains we would be achieving here if we move forward with more ambitious climate policy. But I think it's one of those things that you want to do to sort of take that issue off the table politically, so you can try to build more support for your program going forward.
So it's an interesting question about how you do it. So if you want to tax carbon on imported goods, some have suggested simply an import tax or a tariff. You suggest an alternative called a countervailing duty. So for those of us who are not trade geeks, can you explain the difference?
So I want to stress that I think the first best approach would be to do a domestic carbon tax that then serves as the basis of what you would design in new legislation for a carbon tax on the imports that's equivalent to your domestic tax. That's the cleanest under existing international trade law. That's analogous in form to what the EU is trying to do by having a carbon border adjustment mechanism based off their cap and trade program. But I will also note that having worked on climate policy for more than 2 decades, off and on in Washington, I know it's not always easy to get new legislation. So I've recently written a proposal that was published at Resources for the Future, suggesting that you could use existing statutory authorities. They may be imperfect, but just like EPA using the Clean Air Act, it's imperfect for addressing this problem, but use what you can do now and use countervailing duty law. And so the idea here is to say, we would take and interpret the failure of another country to price carbon as evidence of an implicit subsidy for production in their energy intensive manufacturing. And so if they then try to sell goods into the United States, we would say that implicit subsidy is subject to a tariff, a countervailing duty, that would try to address the fact that we think they are effectively subsidizing their domestic manufacturing to the harm of our domestic industry. So there's a bit of a process one would have to go through. This is a different interpretation than what has been done historically under countervailing duty law. But I will acknowledge that last year you had a kind of reinterpretation of countervailing duty law to think about currency manipulation. So it's not a specific, we're going to subsidize this industry and harming the US. It's more sort of more general macro policy that has effectively subsidized some exporters bringing goods into the United States. You could think about an analogous approach here that the Department of Commerce could pursue under existing law to craft regulations that would count the failure to regulate or price carbon in other jurisdictions as a basis for a countervailing duty.
So help me out here. If we haven't priced carbon, can we do that? Can we get away with that at the WTO? I mean,
so I think there's a couple of ways one could go about this. One is you could say, let's just figure out what's the effective price through our regulations today. In fact, there's something similar to that has been proposed by Senator Coons and Congressman Peters in this Congress. I think that's very hard to do. I've done work other parts of my research program on how we do retrospective evaluations of our regulations. We actually don't have the evidence right now to do that, I think, in a credible way. Mm-hmm. I think one could say, let's just use the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon, which measures the climate damages when we emit another ton of CO2, is used in US government rulemaking for estimating the benefits of our regulations. We could say everyone should be doing this. Now, that may set us up for a challenge because we're not actually imposing, I think, policies and regulations as stringent as that. But it could be one of these things where like we start to implement this or we put this on the books and it may be a sense of like, this is where we're going. And if we all, ideally, you're not doing this because you want to raise revenue on your imports. Ideally, you're creating the incentives so that your trade partners are ramping up their ambition as you ramp up your own ambition here at home. So ideally, if you're the Biden administration, you hope to never collect a dime through such a countervailing duty mechanism, but you hope it does give additional leverage to your negotiators as they're trying to work with other countries for them to enhance their domestic mitigation programs.
Let me switch gears a little bit and talk about a related issue. So we often in the current debate talk about energy production in a binary way. We're either talking about carbon-based fuels or we're talking about alternative sources such as wind and solar. But there is another option, that's nuclear. Does nuclear power have a role to play in future energy production?
I think nuclear has a lot of potential long-term. And I say a lot of potential because it is a way to generate a lot of electricity in a facility that you would build that would operate for a very long time. The challenges in the United States is nuclear is very expensive. And when we think about the ways in which we finance these builds, there's just not a lot of appetite in the financial sector for banks making loans to be able to make a loan to a project that is as costly up front as what we have for nuclear. We do have a number of subsidies through the tax code for new nuclear. We've also had loan guarantees to try to help reduce the cost of borrowing for nuclear. It's really expensive. And I think this is one thing when we're sort of thinking long-term and we're thinking globally, we're going to need more nuclear around the world, I think, just because we're going to need more of anything that can produce energy and meet energy demand that's zero carbon. I think we need to sort of push on all these fronts. How much nuclear we use in the US at the end of the day, I think will depend on how cheap renewables become, coupled with the opportunity of using storage technology so that we can always have the lights coming on when we flip a switch, even if we're generating most of our electricity from renewables. That is the concern or the reservation some have about renewable power, that as we really increase the renewable share of our electricity system, if the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing in a part of the country, we may not be able to turn on the lights. And storage, which is something that gets significant support in the House reconciliation package, is something that could help address that concern. Or it could be a future in which we do carbon capture and storage technology on fossil, where we're capturing the CO2 and so it doesn't go in the atmosphere and we stick it deep in the ground, or we use it to make new materials. I think the future of nuclear and how much nuclear we have is going to depend on a kind of technology race of these next generation technologies, whether it's long-term storage, carbon capture and storage, or the next generation of nuclear.
So the technology question is a really interesting one. We have had at the Tax Policy Center an interesting disagreement among my colleagues about the efficacy of a carbon tax. So Thornton Matheson has written that correct carbon pricing is indeed the key to unlocking climate change problems. But Eric Toner has argued we can't tax our way out of this. The real solution is technological innovation. So who's right?
Well, we need technological innovation, but I think it's important to think through what are the policies we're going to use to help drive that innovation in the longer term, but also how are we going to drive changes today? We need, every ton we reduce is incredibly important given how long carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere. What is emitted today is likely to stay up there for hundreds of years. So we need to be reducing our emissions today. That means deploying existing technologies today. That's something that I think putting a price on carbon can be quite effective at doing. I think if we have a clear price signal, that also makes it a lot easier for entrepreneurs and inventors to think about how they can undertake their work to make that next generation of low carbon or zero carbon technologies commercially viable. So I think a carbon price is also a key driver for innovation. I don't think it's sufficient. I think we can have other programs where we spend money to support R&D, and especially some of the basic science that would be a key underpinning of those new next generation commercial technologies. But I think the idea that we just need technological innovation and that'll solve the problem, I think doesn't do justice to the role that carbon pricing can play, both in promoting innovation long-term, but also reducing our emissions today.
But haven't they already gotten that signal? I mean, it seems to me that the people in the battery industry and other folks are working as hard as they can. I mean, do they need more of a signal? There's a lot of money to be made here. What are the impediments to innovation? Is it just simply where we are in technology?
Well, I think it's, one thing that I look to is what prices do businesses use on carbon when they're making decisions, and more and more businesses in recent years, in part because of pressure they're getting from their investors, have been disclosing what internal carbon prices they use. Mm-hmm. And they use them in different ways. So there's a bit of an apples to oranges issue here. But having said that, if you look at the carbon prices that companies use, certainly there's still a number that use zero. There's some who use sort of $0 to $10. There's some who use $20 to $40. There's some who use more than $100 a ton. There's a lot of variation in what prices they're using that's informing their investment decisions and their long-term planning. And I think that kind of variation is a sign that we in the policy world have not been very effective sending clear signals to them about where the policy program is going. I don't know what price is right. If I were to advise businesses right now, I wouldn't be able to say, here's the right price to use because of where policy is going, because I don't know where policy is going, but I'm pretty confident that in 10 or 20 years, we'll look back and know that the prices, the big dispersion in prices today is a sign that some of them got it wrong. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the kind of yo-yo approach to climate policy in the United States, the fact that a lot of our policy has been through the tax code and often has sunset provisions. So a given subsidy or tax expenditure may only be on the books for 2 or 3 years until you go through the next legislative cycle to get it extended. All that has a kind of chilling effect, I think, relative to what it could be if we had a comprehensive economy-wide carbon price and a sense that it was going to be politically durable for the years and decades to come.
Well, we're out of time. Joe Aldy, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and learn a little bit more about these environmental issues. And thank you, and thanks to our audience.
Thank you, Howard. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.